Hi everyone, Caoimhin here from MTU's Blackrock Castle Observatory. We are going to be taking a look at the morning sky to finish off our Messier Marathon. Now in the last video we left off with M83, but there are a couple of other objects up next to the plough which you could see earlier in your Messier Marathon at this time of the year. So there's two just in the base of the plough or the Big Dipper here. We'll zoom in nice and close. Already, only the Messier Marathon objects, only the Messier catalogue objects are going to be highlighted. This is M97, the Owl Nebula. Kind of does look like the round face, almost of a barn owl with these two kind of round eyes. The beak would be there in the middle. Just next to it is a galaxy, the Surfboard Galaxy, and really just next to it, they're very close together. This is M108, a really interesting looking galaxy that we're seeing here, edge on, so we don't get to see its disc-like shape. The next one, it's not too hard to find, but it is a little bit difficult to orient Stellarium looking straight up into the sky like this. So yeah, it's just past M101, the Pinwheel galaxy. We're going out to M102, the Spindle galaxy. So this is another galaxy that we're seeing here, edge on, another very fuzzy, interesting, different looking galaxy. So those are up next to the plough. You can really see them whenever they're circumpolar. I appear to have brought up some kind of line by hitting the wrong button there. I'll see if I can get rid of it. There we go. We are going to get back now to where we left off with the Southern Pinwheel galaxy, and I have my little map next to me, as I did in previous videos, to go through this collection of Messier objects. Now, we're after going from about midnight when the Southern Pinwheel galaxy first rose. We're going to push a bit later so that it's almost setting. It's a good chance to catch a bit of a break as you're moving from object to object, and we are waiting for some other objects to rise up into the sky. So, from 83, we are going across to 80, which is just in the top of Scorpio here. You can see we've got quite a few in this constellation of Scorpius. So there's M80, it's a globular cluster, really, really dense, kind of an odd shape. It's not really a perfect sphere like we see with some other globular clusters. From there, we're dropping down to the Crab globular cluster here, M4. You may see that we're getting a lot of low numbers. These are things that are very early in the catalogue. Another really dense cluster here, the Crab globular cluster, very close to Antares. We can then, there's a couple of things over here. It doesn't matter if we go M19, then down to the Flickering globular cluster, or the other way around. We are looking at two globular clusters here. M19, you can see it's a little bit more diffuse. There's still a lot of stars in here. It's definitely not an open cluster, but it is a more spread out globular cluster. We'll come down to the Flickering globular cluster here, and you can see it gets a bit denser in the middle, but still you can see that it breaks up into individual stars, clearly individual stars towards the outside. There are a few objects a little lower in the sky than these two. You can see they're just under the horizon here. We will allow the light to come a little bit higher so we can get down to the Butterfly cluster, but just as we did in previous videos, we'll have to keep pushing later to allow these to come out. Here's a great example of an open star cluster. You can see that it's a lot more open. There's a lot more space between the stars than there would be with a globular cluster. And that open cluster is also almost certainly a little bit closer to us. Now, after zooming out a little bit and pushing a bit later, we can see the moon is getting in the way. So again, the time of month can have a big influence on what's visible during a Messier Marathon. So we'll just push a little bit later into the month, just so we get a little bit closer to the new moon, and that's going to keep the moon a little bit more out of the way. Now from here, I'll just double check. We're going to go across to these two, 28 and 22 here, before we go up to those other objects that we can see above them. So here's M28, it's another globular cluster, and then we're looking at the Sagittarius Great Cluster, similar to the Great Cluster in Hercules. It is a great cluster. It's got a very clear, dense collection of stars there in the center. From there, we're going to move up. There's some nice nebulosity in this area, and we are very close to Sagittarius here, so this is where you would see the Milky Way. So there's a lot of interesting things here. We're here with M8, the Lagoon Nebula. You can see it's got some lovely rosy colors here. This is how it would appear in the city if we removed all the atmosphere and light pollution. You can see we're getting a much more intense show here, a really clear look Just above this M8, and again, I'll bring back the light pollution just so we get a slightly more realistic view what you'd see in the city. You can see this nebulosity is almost connected, but especially with smaller telescopes, it would have appeared only the brighter centers would have been very clear. Now the Trifid Nebula here going up to M20, yep, that is next on the list. It's called the Trifid Nebula because it's split in 3 pieces or 3 lobes by these darker portions stretching across it. So we can see some bluish reflection nebulosity and some reddish here emission nebulosity. So reflecting the light of stars, emitting its own light because it's warm, and then these dark patches absorbing and blocking out the light. So the Trifid Nebula is a really, really interesting, really, really cool one to look at. And then from there, moving up to Webb's Cross M21, an open star cluster. You can see that these are really young, hot blue stars, especially when we take a closer look here. So continuing on our journey, we're going to be going across above the south here. So we're going to go across to M25 before we go up to the small Sagittarius star cloud. So this is M25, another open cluster of stars. We're seeing a lot of formed stars here, stars that are still young and still quite close together, and that's related to the amount of nebulosity we're seeing here because there's a lot of star forming regions. So these are stars that would have emerged from star forming regions. From here, we're going up to the small Sagittarius star cloud, a star cluster on a star field, so we can see this is a really dense, rich area of space with lots and lots of stars. Again, looking into the direction of the center of the Milky Way. Now from here, M24, we will go, we are going to go over to M23 and then back to the Black Swan cluster. So we'll come over here to our open cluster M23, take a look at that with all of those stars still held quite close together but further apart than a globular cluster. We're seeing something very similar here for the Black Swan cluster, another open cluster of stars, and then moving up to the Omega Nebula, which is this lovely richly coloured nebula here. So this is a cluster associated with nebulosity, so this lovely orangey fluffy red glow is connected to all of these stars here that we're seeing, which form an open cluster. As you may be able to tell by now with that kind of looser association of stars. From here, we'll come up to the Eagle Nebula, which is a great one. If we take a closer look here, we can see there's some really clear dark pillars of gas. So these are really clear star forming regions. There'd be stars forming along the edges of these limbs of gas. And in here, in the center of the nebula, there are stars that have formed whose light and heat is pushing away some of these clouds and heating it up and compressing the gas by blowing it away, which helps generate the formation of new stars. So again, looking in towards the Milky Way, it's such a rich, interesting portion of the sky. So we're going to come away back towards the southeast here, away from the east, as we come over to M9 and then up to, I believe, M10. So here we are, a globular cluster. Again, we're looking kind of outside the Milky Way here. We're looking out of the Milky Way, which lets us see these clusters orbiting the Milky Way rather than the open clusters that would have formed inside the Milky Way. So from M9, we're going to go across to M107. So I'll find M10. There's M10, so M107 is just over here. M107 is about halfway between M9 and M10, but a little further towards the south. So there we go, another globular star cluster. It's called the Crucifix Cluster thanks to the bright stars around the center. From there, then we can come back over, so we're pretty much level with M9, going straight up to M10, another globular cluster. Again, really, really rich, really dense. We can see these kind of orangey colours here. So these are older stars reaching the end of their life. And that's very common with globular clusters, that the stars are a little bit older. From there, we'll move up to the Gumball globular cluster, M12. You can see we're getting a lot of lower numbers here. Again, really rich and dense with some brighter stars towards the foreground. In many cases, when we look at globular clusters, there can be a couple of stars truly in the foreground in our galaxy between us and the cluster that we're taking a look at. So now, we're going over to M14. Here's another globular cluster. We can see that's the cluster. These are stars that would be in the foreground in our galaxy between us and that cluster going around the edge of our galaxy.